Hey folks, amen. How are you? How are you? I'll wait for a couple of minutes as you get in and maybe have a quick discussion in scripture. Maybe on your lunch break, you can join in and we can look at Luke chapter 22. In fact, let me put that up there. Um, Luke chapter 22 and verse 31. And let me throw that back up there. There you go. Good, good. Blessings to you all. Camille, God bless you. Cavante, I see you. Clayton, Sharice, Maribel, God bless you. Sydney, Miss Scott Lewis, Dwayne, Jason, Sabrina, God bless you. James, Hannah, my brother. So many of you jumping on. God bless you in the wonderful name of Jesus. Matthew Jackson, God bless you, my dear brother. Simone Hudson, Bernard, Michael Moody, God bless you. And so many of you. Amen. So I don't have a lot of time. So hopefully maybe the next 15 minutes, we can just kind of talk about the importance of asking questions to listening and reading in context. And so I put up a post a little earlier that was designed to kind of discuss that a little bit in a short sentence, just talking about how when we listen in conversation or when we read, the first thing that we shouldn't do is jump to any kind of conclusions or assumptions. What we should do is ask questions, and asking questions is part of how we arrive at interpreting rightly. And so one of the mistakes people make in conversation is the same mistake they make in reading scripture, is that they assume the conclusion or the interpretation. And so when you are first reading anything or listening to anything, you are not necessarily close to the interpretation at that point. You've got a little ways to go. Unless the interpretation is just super, super obvious, you've got some unpacking to do. You've got some questions to ask. And so I want to demonstrate a little bit of that using Luke chapter 22, verses 31 to 32. Hit the share button because I want more people to be able to see what we're doing here. And we can have a little bit of a discussion on that. But I'm going to be reading from Luke chapter 22, 31 and 32. Jesus says here, and I'll be reading from the CSB version. He says, "Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." And so, of course, in 33, he goes on, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to die." And Jesus tells him, "The rooster will not crow today until you deny 3 times that you know me." And so that's the whole context there. 31 to 34 is the entire context. But it's not, I should say it's the text, but it's not the whole context. In fact, if you read all of chapter 22 and the latter half of chapter 21, it's going to give you more of the context. And so the first thing that you want to do is make sure you are reading it correctly. And so reading is, when we say reading is fundamental, we're not just talking about the ability to pronounce the syllables, pronounce the words correctly, but to be able to understand what you're reading. So the first step in interpreting anything, that is whether you're hearing it or whether you're reading, is to make sure that you are reading it or hearing it correctly. So if it's in a conversation, you can say, did I hear you correctly? Did you say that? Now, what am I doing there? When I'm asking that, obviously, I am not accusing the person of having said anything. I am letting the person know that it is possible that I may have heard what you said wrongly. And so notice, did I hear you correctly? Because again, the first thing that you want to ascertain and to make sure is that you heard correctly. Well, it's the same thing with the reading. Did you read it correctly? Which is why I always advocate using a translation or version, an English version of scripture that is very obviously sound in their translation methodology, but is also very modern, so that you can walk away. It's no sense in reading something. Forget all the poetry of the King James and all that other stuff. That's complete nonsense. I mean, listen, try reading the prologue of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Now, that's what you call old English, right? By the time you get to King James, you're talking about Middle English, and even still, there wasn't a lot of development there. And so it's forget about poetry. The point of communicating is understanding, right? And so the Bible does communicate in a number of different genres, but people say, "Oh, I just love the prose and this, that, and the other." Well, what good is that if you don't understand? And so get a good Bible translation that makes it really, really clear about what it is saying. All this stuff about evil concupiscence. The average person has absolutely no idea. But if I said evil desires, well, immediately. So that's a modern way of saying the exact same thing. So the first thing you need to do is make sure you are hearing or reading clearly. Did I understand what I just read in terms of its clearest communication? Now, that is an aspect of interpretation, but you are not drawing at that point any final conclusions. The next piece is to ask questions about what you have just read, because in asking questions, you can develop a greater understanding of what you have heard or what you have read, rather than assuming that you already know. And now this is the bane, if you will, or the crux of most disagreements in social media spaces. People come to the discussion with an axe to grind, with their minds already made up about what you are saying. It happens to me all the time, and I'm sure it happens to you. They don't even read in context. They assume that you are talking about something, and then they carry the conversation in the direction of what they have assumed. And you're there trying to say, listen, don't come in disagreeing, come in asking questions. Because if you had asked questions, you would have realized that by asking the question, that's not what I was talking about. But because you came in assuming, we got off on the wrong track because you were already disagreeing with something that I never even said. You see what happens? That's what happens to folks that don't ask questions. They make assumptions, and their assumptions create tension in the discussion, and even in terms of what they are reading. And so we've got to be very careful. So let's look at the text here, and I want to just show you something here that is very, very popular with this text that's based on an assumptive reading. Jesus says, "Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." And so in 31, I've got you. In 32, I've got you, your, and your, right? So that's 5 uses of the pronoun su. Hang on just a second. That's 5 different uses of the pronoun su. And so one can easily assume that means exactly the same thing every time you see it, that these are just all references to the same person. Well, in most of the references between 31 and 32, Su is a second person pronoun singular. But in 31, the first use of the root word Su is actually the Greek word humas, which is from the same root word Su, but it is a second person pronoun plural. And so here's how it reads. Watch this. It's going to change everything that you thought you understood about this reading. Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you all like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that is singular, that your second person pronoun singular faith may not fail, and you second person pronoun singular, when you second person pronoun singular have turned back, strengthen your second person pronoun singular. So all of the uses of you or your, Su, appear in the second person pronoun singular, except for the first use. And while Su is the root of that word, the actual word is humas, and it means and you all. That is you all. It's kind of like in the country where y'all or you all. It is in the plural form. So let's start asking questions now, right? Let's start. Don't jump to any conclusions. Don't jump to any conclusions. Let's start asking questions. Well, the first question could be, well, if Jesus is talking to Peter and he uses the plural form you all, who else is Jesus talking about, right? And so we can, now don't start answering anything yet. Just keep asking some questions. Write that down. Who else is Jesus talking about? Why did Jesus switch from the plural you all to the singular you immediately after? Why does Jesus make that switch, right? So that's another question that you can ask. Here might be another possible question that you can ask. What does Jesus mean by sifting like wheat? Ask the question to the text. Don't answer anything, just ask, right? See, again, don't assume you know, and don't assume the interpretation too early. Just ask questions. In fact, the more questions you ask, the more you actually might learn about this particular text. What are some other questions? But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. Fail in what way? Turn back how? What does Jesus mean by strengthen your brothers? You know, so these are some of the questions that can be asked when we are reading this text. And so since we only chose verses 31 to 32, that's not all of the context, but it's enough of it for us to ask the text a number of questions that might help us understand something about this text that we had not considered before. So for instance, it might be fair to assume that the average person reading this text assumed that Jesus was only talking to Peter. Well, verse 31 tells us that Jesus was not only talking to Peter, that he was talking to a group of people. And so who else was Jesus referring to? Well, that's where we want to consider all of our text. When we look up in chapter 22, we find Jesus had just eaten a meal with them. This is not the Passover meal, because Jesus had already told them that he is not going to eat that meal, the Passover, again until his kingdom is established. This is a meal at the beginning of the Passover week. And so Jesus is already having a discussion with his disciples, and he tells them, one of you, there is that same word there, humas, one of you, plural, second person pronoun plural, is going to betray me. And they're like, You know, is it me? Is it who could it possibly be? Right? And so then it says in verse 24 that a dispute arises among them in the plural. Who's the them? Well, this is the disciples. The disciples are having a discussion, and they want to know who's the greatest. Who's the greatest among us? Now, you might assume that this discussion is simply about ego. But again, in context, if I'm reading this, I've got to also consider the culture, right? And so you have to understand again who this group of people are. They are students, they are disciples. They are called Talmidim in the plural. One student is called a Talmid. Well, in the Jewish culture, particularly in the first century, it would have not been uncommon to see groups of students following their teacher around. Now, here's another interesting thing. Again, understanding culture, not assuming. One of the things is that there was always a standout student among the Talmudim. We talk about the teacher's pet and that kind of thing in our modern sense. Well, in groups of Talmudim, there would always be a chief student. This is typically the rabbi's favorite student. This is usually the brightest one. This is the one who usually gives the most answers. This is the one that the teacher typically calls on the most. In Jewish literature, they call that person the Talmid Hakam, C-H-A-C-H-A-M, Talmid Hakam. That means the wise student or the brightest student. And so when we understand that culturally, it is not difficult to, when we read the Gospels and we're reading about Jesus's interactions with his disciples, it is easy to identify who Jesus's Talmid Hakam would have been. It would obviously have been Peter. He's the one with most of the answers, right or wrong. He's the one who is with Jesus most of the time. Even when it's not the 12, it's the 3. And when it's the 3, it's Peter who is usually sticking out the most. And so the dispute about the greatest is a discussion about who's the Talmid Hakam, who's the standout student among us all. And so they're having that kind of discussion. Again, not assuming, but taking context into consideration. It helps us to be able to better understand what's going on here. What I'm doing here is working back to 31 and 32, and I'm showing you that Jesus's discussion was not just with Peter, but it was with all of the disciples. And he tells them, now here's what leadership looks like in the kingdom. It's not like with the Gentiles where they leverage power over others in order to demonstrate dominance and control. He's like, it's not going to be like that in the kingdom. Whoever is going to be the greatest among you, there it is again, there is that pluralized word, humas, there. Whoever is going to be the greatest among you is going to be the greatest servant, right? And so when we get to 31, Jesus specifically calls out Simon's name. But then he says, Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you all like wheat. And so one of the things that we by asking questions, one of the things that we have already learned is that Jesus is not just talking to Peter, he's talking to his own group. And so evidently, sure, Hasatan, the Satan, does want to sift Peter, but he doesn't just want Peter. He wants the other disciples. Anybody who has followed Jesus, who has taken up their cross. Here's the application here. Satan wants you. He wants you really, really bad. He really wants to destroy your life. And so the next question then to ask is, what does it mean by sifting like wheat? And so again, we don't want to jump to any conclusions. We want to ask questions. Well, there is a parallel to this particular verse. In Amos 9:9, this is the way it reads: "For behold, I will command and shake the house of Israel among all the nations as one shakes with a sieve, but no pebble shall fall to the earth." And so a sieve is like a strainer. It is used to separate one thing from another. You know, you probably have seen, you probably cook, or you've seen somebody else cook, and they get a strainer, and it takes maybe some of the skin, and the juices fall into another container. It's sifting it, right? Now, in this particular sieve, this is a wheat sieve. And so Jesus has used this metaphor to say that the Satan has desired to sift all of you like wheat. And that is, of course, to separate the wheat from the chaff. Now, the wheat would have been heavier, the chaff would have been lighter. And so the idea in this particular sieve is to sift like wheat. That is not to retain the wheat, but to separate the chaff from the wheat. So what Satan wants to do is blow you away like the lighter chaff. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, he wants you to become unstable. And so the context tells us a little bit more about what the Satan wants to do. Now, here's the reason why Jesus talks to all of the group, but then even more specifically to Peter. It is because, again, in asking questions and doing comparative reading, it is most likely because of Peter's influence with the group. It is Peter who announces, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And notice what Jesus says: "And when you, singular, are strengthened, are converted, strengthen your brethren." And so the Satan was banking on Peter's lapse in faith, his failure to become everybody's failure. Do you see that? And so it's connected together. This is why when you were reading Galatians 2, it is so important to understand why Paul withstood Peter to his face in front of everybody. He said, the Galatian brothers are being carried away with your foolishness. And your foolishness has been so impactful that even Barnabas has gotten carried away with it. And so Peter's influence was critical to the behaviors of others in the body of Christ in the early church. And so Jesus's prayer is not just for the moment with the rooster and the denial. Jesus's prayer goes further, years into the future, because Peter's constant failure could result in the sifting of not only his life, but the sifting of others. And so you can see Jesus's intercession has prevented what Satan would like to do from ultimately happening. And so Jesus's prayer doesn't always prevent us from falling, but his prayer, however, does prevent us from falling away. And so our temporary lapse in faith is not a final or an ultimate reality. That you understand what I'm saying? And so when we are reading this text here, that is the reason why we've got to ask questions, as opposed to, and that's with any text, and that is also with any conversation. Don't assume anything. Ask questions. Let me go a step further and say this. Everybody in a conversation is not equal. We may be equal in our humanity, equal in dignity, but we're not necessarily always equal in role and responsibility. Does everybody agree with that? I'm sure you do, right? So let's say I am in conversation on Facebook or on Twitter with a person that has a master's degree or even a PhD in botany, B-O-T-A-N-Y, right? Now, my only experience is having grown a tomato or two in my backyard, right? So I might have some ideas about how to grow things. But if I am in discussion with a person who is a botanist. This is a person who is expert in the field of plants, right? So it would be better for me to enter into the conversation, not assuming that I know the same thing that the botanist knows. That's number one. Not assuming that we have the same understanding, that I'm on the same level. Not even assuming that when we are discussing something that I'm right and he or she is wrong. What I should do is enter the conversation asking questions. And I should give this person the benefit of the doubt that it is possible, it is highly possible, that they know more about botany than I do. And so I should at least consider that their years of experience and education is the reason that they see something differently from me. And while I might think in that moment I am right, I should at least consider that with all their years of experience, perhaps the reason they see it differently is because they know something that I don't know. So what humility does is it tells me, rather than coming in disagreeing or coming in with a formed conclusion, what I need to do is come in asking questions. Because when I ask questions, it helps me to get to the right conclusion or the right interpretation a lot faster, or not even faster. But again, it helps me to get to the right conclusion. You see what I mean? And so I'm only using one example, but again, before you start drawing conclusions, ask questions. Ask questions. And that is why so many of our conversations on here break down. People jump in thinking that they know what they're talking about, and they're totally missing the point because they haven't asked any questions. They've come in making all kinds of assumptions. And granted, we are all wrong at various times. There's nothing wrong with admitting that. But you know what I respect? I respect a person that will mid-sentence or mid-march turn around and say, you know what? I stand corrected. I had it totally wrong here. I thought that what you were saying was this, that, or the other. Now, I respect that. But you want to know something better? Don't even get that far. Don't come in assuming at all. Come in asking the question. And then that way, the person who originally made the statement will never accuse you of misspeaking or misquoting or anything, because you haven't done that. You've said, if I'm understanding you correctly, or if I heard you right, this is what I'm taking. And then that person can say, oh, no, you missed it. This is what I really meant. And so they can correct what you thought you heard, but at least you are not accusing them or assuming that they did say something that in fact they didn't say at all. And so I think we ought to practice reading and listening in context, because there's a lot about this particular text that many people have assumed they understood. But when you go back and you read it and you reread it in context, not only historical context and literary context, but also within the cultural context, and you start asking certain questions, you start finding out, wow, I didn't know as much about that text as I thought I knew. I always thought it meant this. And maybe you're not far off. But just because you're not far off doesn't mean that you are understanding there's a thing that they call authorial intent. That is the intent of the author. So the goal of interpretation is not what you think it means. It's what did the author or the speaker intend to communicate? That's what you're after. And so just because you thought I said doesn't mean that that's what I meant. And even when somebody does say something, sometimes what they mean differs slightly than what they actually said. If I say on here, Pastor Bishop Sidney Wheatley, that's my dude. That's my dog, right? If somebody was not familiar with Black urban culture, right, or as they call it, there is a grammatical term for urban grammar. But if they weren't familiar with it, they, let's say 2,000 years from now, somebody writes a text, and it literally is the conversation that me and Bishop Wheatley had, and somebody writes it in Mandarin, and they translate the text into Mandarin. And 2,000 years from now, some Chinese are reading it and said, Damon called Bishop Wheatley his dog. And then one of the students says, well, let's get back to the original English in order to find out what the word dog means. And so then when they go to the lexicon, the word dog says it is a 4-footed animal with the tail and 2 ears and paws. And it starts giving off all of the different kinds of dogs. There are more species of dogs than any other kind of animal, this, that, or the other. And so then they conclude, man, he called Bishop Wheatley an animal. Oh, man, that's terribly insulting. When the reality is that although I did use the word dog, the literal meaning of what I intended to communicate has nothing to do with an animal at all. It has everything to do with, that's my dude, that's my guy, that's my buddy. And so does dog have anything to do with that at all? Absolutely. From a cultural idiomatic standpoint, we consider to be dog man's best friend. Dogs stick with you. Dogs are true, even when people sometimes walk away. You've seen the video of sometimes the soldier is killed in combat, and they bury the soldier, and the dog will literally go to the soldier's grave daily and lay there. I mean, these dogs are true. They are loyal. And so in an idiomatic way, when you call somebody, that's my dog, this is my ride or die, this is my dude, my day one. All of these different things have meanings. The thing is not what it means to you, it's what did I mean when I was communicating it. And that's where making assumptions. And so those Chinese brothers and sisters reading the text 2,000 years from now, if they're not asking the right questions, they might assume that I just called Bishop Wheatley an animal. And that has literally nothing at all to do with what I said. And that's where presuppositions are. Listen, let me say this about presuppositions. We all have them. And it is impossible to rid ourselves of presuppositions, right? Because we all have a worldview that has been formed by experiences and all kinds of stuff. So even when we are talking about not being presuppositional, we don't mean in the absolutist sense, because it is not possible for us to arrive at anything with the cleanest mental slate possible. We already have information there. And so the goal then is to limit my presuppositions, because I already have a whole bunch of them. But if I can cut my presups down from 100 to 5, I got a better chance of actually hearing you for what you meant to communicate than what I think you communicated. And so I'm not going to be able to totally rid myself of my presuppositions. But as Dr. C.J. Rhodes said, I've got to be able to ask clarifying questions. Now, what I'm taking away from what you just said is this: correct me if I am wrong, and you have left room to suggest to the person who said it, I may have understood you wrongly. I'm open to correction, but this is what I heard, or at least I think I heard. And so you are asking that clarifying question to make sure that you are actually understanding rather than assuming. I pray that this is helping, because I want us to not just be better interpreters of scripture. I want us to be better communicators with each other. And a lot of what the conversations and the dialogue that I'm reading on here, even on my page, is folks like two birds passing each other in the air. They're not even on the same page, because most of the time one person is not really listening to the other. When one person's talking, that person's already trying to form their response, and they haven't really even heard what it is that you are saying. And so, this happens a lot. And so I think cutting down on those presuppositions and really learning how to listen in context as well as read in context will really help our communications be a lot better, a lot healthier, a lot more edifying. And I'm not saying we won't have disagreements. And even in our disagreement, we can still hear each other. And so that at least when we are disagreeing, at least we're having an honest disagreement. At least I'm not disagreeing with what I thought you said. That's the worst kind of disagreement. I'm looking at you like, dude, that's a straw man argument. You know what a straw man is the straw man was put out in the field by the farmers to give the idea to the crows that somebody was out there. And so the crows would be scared off from landing on the crop because they think somebody's actually out there. Well, the straw man is not really the man. It's a representation of the man. And so what sometimes people will do is they will pretend to listen and they will construct a straw man of what you said, which doesn't really represent what you really said. And then they will knock that down and proclaim victory in the argument when in fact they have not even disagreed with you. They've disagreed with a straw man argument that they set up. And so sometimes people are not even interested in what you said. Sometimes they're just interested in winning the discussion. And so that makes communication very, very difficult and sometimes impossible, especially when people are not honest about why they're even in the discussion. You all have seen it many times before. Some folks only show up to disagree. They don't say, they never hit like, thumbs up, love. They never, hey man, just, that's good what you just said, or whatever. They never show up until they see something that, here's something I can jump in on. And then they immediately go for the disagreement. And I had an uncle that he used this word. I've become very fond of this word over the years. He uses this word. Well, he did when he was alive. He would call people like that cantankerous. And so that's become, a favorite word of mine now. That's a very cantankerous kind of behavior. It's disingenuous. It's dishonest. You're not really there to learn or to listen or to even contribute to a healthy dialogue. You're only there to be disagreeable. And the irony now is that same uncle who would talk about cantankerous folks, that was exactly the way he was. My uncle had it so bad that the only way to enjoy being around him is that you always had to kind of be agreeable with him, because he would find anything negative to talk about. And the only way to kind of have a pleasant moment is to jump on his side and say, yeah, I agree with you, so forth and so on. But my own uncle was also so cantankerous that as soon as you sided with him, he would jump on the other side just to keep the disagreement going. So when I see people communicating like that, I already know what I'm dealing with, because I had years of listening to my uncle do the very same thing. And some people want to be right all the time. And I don't even know if that's even correct, because if you were interested in being right, then you would listen, because your position is wrong. And so I just think some people just love disagreement and or whatever their motivation is. But I just wanted to get on for a few today and encourage everyone about the importance of asking questions, how important that is to actually listening and reading anything in context. And so here's what I'll do for the next couple of minutes. I know you all have to get off. I've interrupted your day. I'm working as well. I've got things that I'm doing, but I want to take a couple of minutes. Maybe if you have some questions that you'd like to ask. I haven't done a live for a while now, and people have been asking, man, when are you going to jump back on the live? And time has been, I'm in the beginning of dissertation process, working on the prospectus, also traveling a lot. And but I want to stay connected to all of my brothers and sisters here that I have grown to love and appreciate over the last few years. So if you have a question, feel free. There's my dude, Joel. What's going on, man? But ask a question if you have it. A couple of questions I might have time for. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm already at the bottom of the screen. So if you have asked something already and I didn't see it, feel free to type it again. It doesn't allow me to scroll back too far, so I will have missed it. Okay, so let's see. Victor is saying, is there a reason that most translations don't use the plural in Luke 22? Is there a reason not to translate it to something like you all? And so there are translations that do translate it more so in the plural. Most of them translate the word you, and again, the word you in English can be plural as well as singular. I don't know the full answer to that, but here's my guess. My guess is this, is that most translations, there are essentially three different kinds of translations. There is the formal equivalence where you are going word for word. And so in doing that, the translator is not trying to be the interpreter. The translator is trying to stick as close to the original word that was used, right? Interpretation involves understanding context. And so then there is what you would call dynamic equivalence, and that is really more thought for thought. And then you have optimal equivalence, and that is a combination of both. And so the version that I tend to prefer that does that the best, I think, and I'm biased, is the CSB, because they combine both formal and dynamic equivalence into one. So it is very, very scholarly, yet it is also very, very modern. I think the ESV does a good job with that as well, but most translations are just trying to stick as close to the wording that is used and how that word would be best translated in modern English. And so it doesn't mean that that first you, humas, can't be translated. If you're looking at the text in Greek, you would see it. You would know that it shares the same form, su, as all of the other yous, but humas is plural. So you would know that if you were looking at it in the Greek text. And so that is the importance of word studies. And so reading is important for clarification, to make sure I'm reading clearly, but it doesn't stop there. And that's where understanding the relationship between words used in a phrase or a sentence is also important. And so I could see how it would be easy for us to assume that every form of the word you was the same form, but that first one is plural, which changes how we understand that text, if not significantly. So that's a great question, Brother Victor. Appreciate you asking that question there. Let's see. Anybody else? Anybody else with any questions? Anybody with any other questions there? Let's see. I am scrolling down. Joel made a good comment. He said, "You preached today, man, that verse about not being sifted as wheat, meaning a loss of faith not being permanent." And he says, I'm proof of that, man. I'm grateful that you found encouragement in that. Anybody else? Any questions? Anybody with any other questions there? Let's see. Joel Faust. He says that Bible.cc lets you see a verse in parallel with a ton of different translations, which can help draw out some of those distinctions. Good stuff. Keith Anderson asked a question. What advice would you give to a student who is currently in seminary and asked to take spiritual formation as a mandatory class? Keith, I would say the first thing is watch the video that I did on spiritual formation in it's on YouTube, and I actually discussed that, and I realize it is a mandatory class, but I definitely would encourage you to to watch that video, because seminaries are making it mandatory. That's where they used to have this course in your first year of college called College Survival Skills. Teach you how to survive college courses. Well, there's a way to survive that course without getting pulled into some of the elements that go along with spiritual formation as it is taught. So I kind of talk about that in that video. If you get a chance, definitely check that out. Let's see. Anybody else? One last question there. Rian said, you scrolled past my question. All right, man, I didn't even, let's see. Ryan, I didn't see it. Okay. I said, Rian, I'm just jacking all up, man. Okay, I got you. Here it is. When the discussion is being derailed by a straw man or a red herring, how do you get it back on track? That's a great question. I actually did this yesterday. I did this post and I was talking about, and I got a couple of minutes, but I was talking about Game of Thrones. And so what I did is I just kind of use that as an example. And what I said is that there are generally two reactions to things that are popular on social media. And I use kind of Game of Thrones as a example of that. I said, one group will be like, yeah, Game of Thrones is on. I can't wait. Countdown. It's on now. Don't bother me. This, that, and the other. There's a group of people who obviously like the show. They're excited about it. Then you have that other group that throws out statements like, never seen one episode of it. Never. How many of you are like me that have no intention on watching it, and all these other things? And so I was using that to say that I think people do that because they just don't like to see people enjoy things. And so, and you can sub it out. You can take away Game of Thrones and insert Bird Box. It's the same thing. When people were watching it, you had all those people who just had to make the statement for no other reason but to let you know that I'm not watching it. I don't have any intention on watching it. So I was talking about that as a behavior and why people do that. That was the whole point. Game of Thrones was essential because it wasn't show specific. It was behavior specific. I was talking about that second group. What do they want, a cookie for being different? Or do they just want an axe to grind just to let you know that they, that I have no intention? So that was the whole point. Almost everybody that commented, for the most part, I would say, most people got it. That's why people were hitting the laughing emoji. But then there's that group that didn't get it because they didn't really read it in context. So they wanted the conversation to be about the moral content of Game of Thrones. And I can't tell you how many people I had to say, I'm not talking about the content of Game of Thrones. Whether you watch it or don't watch it is irrelevant. I'm talking about that behavior that causes people to have to announce to everybody, how many of you like me have no intention on watching the playoffs this year? Good for you if you don't watch the playoffs. Big deal. Why is it important? And I'm going to tell you why it's important. It's important because so many other people are watching it. And people feel like they've got to prove to other folks how different they are, whatever their motives are. That's what I was talking about. People who read what I said in context knew exactly what I was talking about. But people who wanted to moralize the conversation, spiritualize it, and one up on everybody with their toxic sanctification and legalism, wanted to make it about why Christians shouldn't be watching the show. And I'm like, hang on a minute. Number one, that's not what I'm talking about. So I had to keep trying to remind people. So one guy who literally later double backed and corrected himself, and I was really thankful. I said, let me ask you a question. What was the point of my post? Not the point of your response, but what was the point of my original post? So he went back, read it, came back with an answer, and I was like, not even close. So then he went back and read it again and got it. And I said, thank you, man. And he was like, you know what? I went off on a tangent, didn't really even read it. You see what happened there? Now, in the end, we kind of saved the discussion. But in fact, all of that really could have been avoided if he realized what was my point, not your point. Not your point. What was my point? You see what I mean? what is the author's intent? See, and that's where folks jack up when they go to biblical readings and conversations. They're too concerned with their thinking. What's my intent? What's my point in the conversation? In order to understand, we need to be concerned with what is the author's intent. And that is where things get completely derailed. So by reminding a person, say, hang on, just slow down for a minute. What was my intent? Not what you think I said, but what was the intent of what I just said? And typically the intent is stated somewhere in what you just said. And all they got to do is kind of clip out one part of it and they'll get it. And when he saw that I had literally made a clear statement about what I mean, he realized, it's like, oh man, I just completely, missed it. And so, yeah, you see, so just remind people about it. Now, Peter said this. He said that sometimes some of the things that Paul has to say is hard to understand. I mean, Peter even admitted it. He's like, Brother Paul can say some things, man, it's kind of difficult to understand. And now, not totally. He said some things. So don't get it twisted, because Paul did write 3/4 of the New Testament. And if 3/4 of the New Testament is hard to understand, then the natural conclusion of that would be we are misunderstanding most of the New Testament. So let's hear Peter in his context. He didn't say everything that Paul said was difficult to understand. He said some things, but then he also said this. He said people who are not genuine, people who have evil intentions, they love to twist Paul's words out of context, even as they do other scriptures. Boom. See how that totally changes everything right there? He didn't say you got license to misunderstand Paul and reinterpret Paul at will, as though Paul's words are all so ambiguous that it's all open to interpretation. He said there's some things that he said it's kind of tough to understand. He said, but the people who are most attracted to contorting Paul's words are the ungodly. And isn't that so true? Because when you start talking to a lot of the cults, first person they shoot for, Paul. When you start dealing with liberal theologians, who do they shoot for first? Paul. You look at the Hebrew roots kind of folks, whether you're talking about British Israelism or Black Hebrew Israelites and all those folks that love to culturally assimilate Jewishness, who are the first people that they want to jack up? Paul. See what I mean? And so the point is that even when people have difficulty communicating in the clearest sense, it's not impossible to understand. Just ask them some questions. Say, man, people tell me all the time, I throw big words out there, this, that, and the other. And I probably do. I'm not trying to show off this, that, and the other. A lot of times I'm not even conscious of it. I throw words out that I use all the time. But it's okay. Just say, hey man, break that down for me, Doc. I don't think that you are not intelligent or this, that, and the other. It's just the way that I said it. You might not have been able to get it, but I can say it in another way. So just ask. But you see, and it's the same thing with me in conversation with you and with others. You don't get it. Again, the worst thing you can do is make assumptions. And that is how false doctrine, disagreement, misunderstanding, all kinds of things happen because of the way that we approach these kinds of conversations. And yeah, there's some things that Paul does say that's difficult. That's why there's theological at the heart of most theological debate is at some point is over something Paul said in Romans or somewhere else. It doesn't mean that he can't be understood. Again. But here's the benefit that we have, and I'm done. Here's the benefit that we all have, right? If I'm in debate with you over something that Paul said, you know how to solve all that? Here's the easiest way to solve all that. If Paul was around, we could just ask him. Say, hey, Brother Paul, what did you mean in Romans 8, 28? Like, what did you mean there? And Brother Paul can say, here's what I meant, right? Now, here's the benefit that we all have. Most of the time when we are in disagreement, we're disagreeing with the author. We're disagreeing with the person that made the statement. And what I'm saying is, here's the benefit that we have that we don't always have with the biblical text, is that we can always ask that person, what did you mean? And perhaps we're not really having a disagreement. Perhaps I only thought you meant to communicate something and I disagreed with it. But if I ask you what you meant, I might find out that I understood wrongly. So we have that benefit. But you know how some people are so stiff-necked and bullheaded? I believe this, and I believe this with all my heart, based on my interactions every day. I believe that there are some people right now who are listening to this conversation right now, that if you had an opportunity to meet Paul, you would try to tell Paul better about what he meant than what he actually meant, because you think you know Romans better than the man that wrote it. I would put everything that I own on it, that some people would disagree with Paul himself about what he said. They're like, oh no, Paul, no, that's not what you meant. That's not what you meant in Romans chapter 10, verse 15, what you meant to say. And Paul's like, let me know when you're done so I can explain to you what I really meant, not what you think I meant, not what your denomination has, how they have interpreted my words there, not your faith tradition. Let me explain to you what I really meant. And some people literally, and the reason I know that is because you do it, people do that all the time. They argue with the writer or the author over a disagreement about what they think you meant. And I can understand if you're having a real, genuine ideological disagreement, but don't have a disagreement about what you think the person means without clarifying first. And some people argue with people about what they think. It's like all these folks running around talking about, oh, all this woke Christianity and all this other stuff, this, that, and the other. Listen, you know why I don't have conversations with them? Because those folks ain't listening to nobody. In fact, what they think is being communicated is not what's being communicated. And so as long as they have their version, their straw man version of what's being said, they're always going to be an accusatory role. And if you ever want to shut a conversation down fast, start off with accusations. And that's why some folks never can really even get to the apology, because they're always in accusatory mode. First thing the man says to his wife, you always, start doing that. See the word always. You have literally branded your wife with a ultimate accusation that no matter how things go, she always behaves that way. How do you think the conversation is going to go after that? What room is it for conversation, since she always behaves that way? As opposed to, honey, I don't like it sometimes when you say this or that. So that's not accusatory. That what you've done is you've said, this is the way that it affects me when you do this. You know what I mean? Or whatever. And it leaves room for discussion for the person to say that, well, that's not what I was doing this time. It might have made you feel the same way, but that's not what I was really doing. But, whatever. But see, we just close conversation off when we start off with the accusatory and presuppositions and assumptions and all that other stuff. All I'm trying to do today is say, if we read the same way that we converse, then we're going to get better results. And that is listening in context. and asking questions. So that's basically all I really wanted to do today. To Sabrina Brantley says, starting trouble. Well, I'm trying to help some of y'all at home too now. And, so I pray that this has been a blessing. And please do share with somebody. I think it could help a lot of us to better our communication style. And God bless you. And I hope to be on again with many of you soon. And if next month, I think it's the 1st through the 4th, if you are going to be at Kingdom Agenda in Dallas, Dr. Tony Evans's conference, I will see you there representing Lagos. So God bless you in Jesus' name.